This is Rick Yates, Technical Services Manager for GGS Pro. In today's brief video, we're going to talk about taking our poinsettias that look so good here in mid-November and getting them to the finish line. Poinsettias are an energy-intensive crop, so we always need to keep an eye on our costs. And this time of year, energy prices in many places in the United States are going up, making it more important than ever. It may be tempting to start turning that temperature down. We need to be careful. We know that Bract expansion is very dependent on our average daily temperature, so our night temperatures are really important. As you can see from the slide, the highlighted region, we'd like to wait until the bracts are about 2/3 of finished size before we start dropping the crop canopy temperature down from 65 to 66, gradually down to 62, and possibly as low as 60 degrees at the end. There are some problems that can be associated with making the night temperatures too cool. Some of our white varieties can start to look yellow or even gold under those cooler temperatures. Probably a bigger concern for most growers is that as we cool the night temperatures, the air is not able to hold as much moisture, and we come closer to the condensation point, and we know that botrytis can make penetration into healthy bract tissue with as little as 2 to 4 hours of free moisture on the bract surface. As we get into mid-November and later, there's quite a bit of bract tissue covering most of the photosynthetic area of the poinsettias. And since bracts don't photosynthesize, it corresponds with a sharp decrease in the amount of fertilizer these plants need. And you can see that represented in our chart. There is a problem with providing too much fertilizer to poinsettias. We know that excess nitrogen in the plant tissue makes them more vulnerable to botrytis and also to powdery mildew. And of course, whiteflies reproduce more rapidly and nitrogen-rich tissue is available as well. The other concern is that in the root system, high soluble salts, and particularly when you go through dry downs, and a lot of growers as we get later in the season like to run the crop dry because the weather is so cold and dark, that when you dry down the soil with a high level of soluble salts in them, you can cause nicks and cracks and fissures in the root system and predispose these plants to Pythium. And with all of the bract tissue that is present, our mind kind of goes to concerns over calcium-related bract disorders. So calcium chloride sprays are really important, and one of the side benefits is that some research through Clemson University indicates that calcium sprays can decrease the risk of botrytis, something to be very welcome to poinsettia growers late in the season as well. There's also some evidence that having calcium sprays applied to the bract tissue may help them be more durable in the sleeving and boxing process when shipping time comes. Our recommendation is to make weekly sprays right up until the time that the poinsettias ship out at a 1/2 ounce per 3 gallons or 1 pound per 100 gallons. We do recommend the addition of capsule, an organosilicon surfactant. We do use a lower rate once the bracts are present, so we're going to recommend 1/4 teaspoon per gallon or 4 ounces per 100 gallons. We also suggest that keep good records and don't apply capsule more than once per week to the bract stage. We're just trying to avoid a surfactant buildup that could be potentially troublesome. When you do make your calcium sprays, you always want to apply it when it'll dry relatively slowly on the bracts. We know that moisture is necessary to get the calcium through the membrane into the bract tissue, so apply it early in the morning or late enough in the afternoon. It'll dry slow, but will still be dry by nighttime. We'll often get a lot of questions about making bonsai drenches or other PGR applications late in the crop to avoid later stretch. Well, after October 25th, for many years, we've been using bonsai drenches roughly a 1/2 part per million. It does vary somewhat by variety. And we believe there's less than a 10% reduction in bract size if we wait until after October 25th to make these applications. For some really vigorous varieties or crops that are just been grown too close together, some other risk factor, you may have to go as high as 1 part per million, but there could be a proportionally higher risk of reducing bract expansion. We prefer that you make a 1/2 part per million drench and evaluate it, and you can apply more if you need to. I think it is important to point out that most varieties, with a few exceptions, really pretty much stop elongating by the time we get to mid-November, so hopefully additional bonsai drenches aren't needed from that point on in the crop. Sometimes there's a need for Bract expansion over and above what can be accomplished by temperature. Now, the number one factor in Bract expansion is night temperature, and if we're trying to push Bracts, we recommend going no higher than 68 degrees at crop height, and the reason for that is that we don't want to fade our Bract color, and 68 degrees should really provide a really strong push to Bract expansion. That should be sufficient. There are some cases, if necessary, that we can make Fascination or Fresco sprays to help expand the Bracts. Now, before we discuss rates, I do want to point out some cautions that, especially if we get the rates too high, we can easily fade the Bract color. We can also cause the petioles to become floppy. And because Fascination and Fresco treatments do deplete carbohydrates to some extent, we can encourage the Cyathia rollout or Cyathia abscission if the rates are too high. So if needed, we suggest you work sparingly with the Fascination sprays, just a 1 part per million foliar spray, and then reevaluate after 5 days to see if more is needed. And once again, we use the lower rate of capsule, and just be careful that we're not applying capsule too often by making calcium sprays and Fascination sprays in the same week if at all possible. This picture shows a crop of poinsettias that definitely suffered from a 3 part per million Fascination spray over the bracts. You can see that we have faded the color a good bit, and the bracts, although they're starting to come back down in this picture, were very spiky, pointed almost straight up in the air immediately after the application. When that happens, usually over a period of several days, that does resolve itself, but it's going to take longer to get the color back into those bracts. That's why we're so cautious about the rates that we recommend. Next thing we want to talk about is Cyathia abscission, or growers like to call it Cyathia rollout. And although it does not actually harm the plant in any way, it's just a part of the maturation process, it is unsightly, and it's something we definitely want to avoid. Depleted carbohydrates within the plant are the primary reason why the Cyathia will upsize, and there's a number of ways that can happen. We talked about earlier the fact that the bracts don't photosynthesize, and so by this stage of the crop, there's not a whole lot of green leaf tissue that's still showing in order to facilitate photosynthesis and the accumulation of carbohydrates. So once you start to ship the crop out, if it's possible to pull those plants apart a little bit further on the bench so that light gets to the lower leaves where they can photosynthesize, that could be a big help. We also want to watch out about our night temperatures. If we can start to gradually decrease those night temperatures once they hit 2/3 of desired size, that's going to slow down the process of the carbohydrate depletion as well. And then, as we mentioned when we're talking about Fascination and Fresco, the less of these products we can use over the top of the bracts once the Cyathia are visible in the growing tips, the better. And last but not least, we know that water stress can also contribute to Cyathia abscission, and we're not talking about running them dry, but actually causing the tissue to flag. If we get them that dry, sometimes that can cause the Cyathia to roll out. Over the last several years, we've seen a reduction in some of the late season flare-ups of Pythium that used to be so common, and I believe it really goes back to the fact that growers, as a rule, are applying a lot less fertilizer in the second half of the crop, and we discussed that a little bit earlier in this presentation, and we would encourage you to do that. Also want you to avoid the temptation to try to run the soil really dry. It really doesn't help in terms of Pythium control. In fact, it might make it worse. We want to strive for even soil moisture, and that'll keep your roots the happiest and minimize the risk from Pythium. If you need to make an application, we have some good products you can apply. We do want to point out there's a lot of resistance documented to Subdue Max, so if you haven't used it all year, it might work well for you. Some research by Ann Chase showed by tank mixing with Clean Growth, you got very good control that way, and you have Fence Stop and Segway to choose from as very safe late season applications. I hope that you found this information useful, and if you have any questions or any comments for us about any future topics you'd like to see us cover, please feel free to let us know.